Hi, welcome to Over the Side. I'm Sean O'Neill. This week I'm going to be sharing another testimony, the second of three. And in this testimony, I'm going to be sharing a period in my life, an experience in my life, which really proved to me why there is such a benefit in completely trusting God in the worst of times. I think you're going to find a powerful time. I think it's going to give glory to God. And I hope you enjoy it. So let's go over the side. So my last testimony was a salvation testimony, and that dates back to 1986 when I became a Christian. We're now going to skip forward a few years to 1991. So by this time, I've been a Christian 5 years and had become firmly embedded in my faith. And this tells the story of what happened as the arrival of my son occurred, our firstborn, and how it caught us by surprise and really took us through quite a journey. So he was born at exactly 8:28 a.m. on Wednesday, October the 2nd, 1991, in the San Hospital in Wahroonga. The surprise that I spoke about was that he was 9.5 weeks early. The reason that occurred, I think, because my wife had been very sick during the pregnancy with ulcerative colitis, and I believe that brought on the early labour. That all happened so quickly that we really didn't have time to think about it too much and what the consequences of that might have been. And any concern that we would have later was really overwhelmed by that initial excitement of this baby arriving into the world. And I guess, like many new parents, the first thing I did was to check out everything was there. He had all his fingers and his toes. And of course, that it's a boy. And I've got to say, I was overwhelmed by the moment. I was filled with so many feelings. You know, during the pregnancy, I think sometimes as a bloke, I feel a little bit separate. I'm not the one carrying the baby, and I wondered how I would feel when he arrived. But when I saw him, there was no doubt. And I was just filled with so many feelings. They were all mixed together: excitement, wonder, pride, and love. And as my wife Sue and I held our new baby, everything in that moment was perfect. But we really had no idea of the huge challenges that were going to face us. Sadly, Sue was only allowed to hold him for a few minutes before he was whisked away, and it wasn't until more than a week later that either of us got to hold our baby again. Because within an hour of being born, he developed serious breathing problems. His lungs were not developed enough for him to breathe on his own because of his prematurity. An air ambulance was called, and from the Adventist hospital in Wahroonga, he was so sick that the emergency team wouldn't actually let him travel by ambulance, and instead he was taken by emergency helicopter to the Children's Hospital. I was with him as they loaded him into the air ambulance. His very tiny, frail body just seemed to disappear into a chaotic mess of tubes and wires and machinery. He was drugged so that he wouldn't be able to fight against the ventilator that was breathing for him. He'd been drugged so that he was paralysed from head to toe, and he lay motionless except for the rhythmic raising and falling of his chest as he breathed in time to the machine. He had a needle in one arm that they were using for injections. He had a needle in his other arm to draw blood. He had a needle in his umbilicus for food and a tube into his lungs to breathe. And as if that wasn't enough, he had various probes on his body for respiration and pulse. He was surrounded by blinking lights and beeping and whirring machines as they loaded him into the helicopter. Sue was still in her room recovering from the birth when they airlifted him out. And I'll never forget that feeling of helplessness as I held Sue a short time later and tried to comfort her as she sobbed and said, "They've taken my baby away." Well, we then knuckled down into dealing with the situation, and the next morning I started a routine of picking Sue up from the maternity hospital and driving her into the children's hospital. We would spend a couple of hours with our baby, and then I would take her back to her own hospital bed. In the evenings, I would go back to the children's hospital alone, and the few hours in between I spent alone, continuously praying. The doctors told me that the first 48 hours would be the worst, and they were giving me no guarantees. They said he was a very sick little boy. Well, the doctors were true to their word, because at 11:28 p.m, just before midnight, on Friday night, they called me at home and they said, "He's taken a turn for the worst. You better come into the hospital." And so I drove all the way praying out loud, and I've got to say it was more in desperation than in faith. I was facing the very real chance that at only 2 days old, that my son might die. It was late at night, and the children's hospital had shifted into night mode. Most of the corridors were in half light as I walked through what looked like an empty hospital. Everyone in their rooms, no one walking the corridors. And I was haunted by the thought of how sick Sue had been throughout the pregnancy, and how it all seemed so unfair. And I was asking myself, and I was asking God, where were the miracles that I'd seen over the last 5 or 6 years while I'd been ministering overseas? There, I'd prayed for the sick. I'd seen tumours shrink under my hand. I'd seen blind eyes that had been healed and opened. I'd seen cripples that had walked. But why was it here? This time, the more I prayed for Sue, the sicker she had seemed to get. And I felt like nothing was in my control. No matter how hard I tried, there was nothing I could do. I didn't want to face these things that I was going through. I just didn't feel I had that sort of strength. I'd reached my limits, and all I wanted to do was run away from the pain and the anguish. But in the midst of those feelings that night, a little after midnight, I had an encounter with God. And it was a real encounter that was more real to me in that moment than the ground under my feet. As I stepped into the lift to go up to the intensive care ward, the elevator doors closed slowly, but it suddenly seemed as if time stood still. And I was surrounded by the thick presence of God. It was so real to me. And it was like being in two places at the same time. I was still in the lift, but I was also standing before God. And in my mind, God spoke to me. And I knew I had to make a choice. I could either struggle to fight this battle all by myself, or I could completely let go and let God do as he would do. You know, the Bible talks about a gift of faith, and that's the only way that I can really describe what happened next. I knew more surely than I knew my own name that whatever I asked of God right then, he would do. There'd be no variation. There'd be no holding back. There was no ambiguity. God wouldn't change his mind. It was 100% certain that I knew that God was going to answer what I asked next. The impossibility was, though, that I also knew that there was only one thing that God required that I ask him, only one thing he wanted me to do. And that was I had to hand my son over to him. There wasn't any other option. I had to hand my son over to him with absolutely no guarantee. It was like I had to choose between God and my own son. And as I continued in that timeless space inside the elevator, the world stood still. I could make the choice and refuse God and try to hold on to my son myself, or I could give him to God. Deep inside me, I knew that if I refused God, it would be like saying to him that my son was more valuable to me than Jesus was. Because God didn't hold back his own son for me. And so now, how could I hold back my son from him? It would be like spitting in God's face. If I refused, how could I ever tell God again that I loved him and served him? If I wanted, I could hold on to my son, but in gaining that, I could lose God. Now, I know that in every trial we face, God will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we can stand, but will always provide a way out. And so I prayed. I prayed to God that whatever happened, he would give me a way to live with it. Especially crazy as it seemed, I also prayed that if he died as a result of me handing him over to God, that he would give my wife Sue the ability to understand what I had done without hating me for it. I felt like in some ways I was betraying her, because surely what I needed to do was to stand in faith for her too. But out loud, trembling as I prayed, I said, God, I don't know what is going to happen. You're asking me to do this with no guarantees, but I put it in your hands. Whether he lives or dies is up to you alone. Either way, I will follow you. But I couldn't stand the pain any longer, and so I also asked, but whatever is going to happen, make it happen tonight. Because I can't live another day like this. As I spoke that, something happened in that moment inside me. Something broke. Every wall went down and every defense disappeared, and I knew that God had heard me. And then suddenly the lift doors opened and I went into the ward to see my son. But I was different because all the fear had left me. I wasn't carrying the burden any longer. God somehow had taken it incredibly. From that moment on, And especially from the next morning, I knew God was in control. I knew that God was going to bring him through. And that doesn't mean that he was instantly well. He was still very sick. But every time the doctors gave us bad news, although it was still a shock and although it came with pain and anguish, something was different. I knew God was intervening. I knew God was miraculously healing my son. The battle was no longer ours, it was his. It was like an army of sickness was sent against us from that moment, but in every circumstance God rose up victorious. God had decreed that he would live, and no amount of opposition was going to prevent it. There was a grace that had come purely as a gift from God. Now, it's difficult, I've got to say, to explain to someone who's never experienced it what the peace of God feels like in those sorts of circumstances. You can't explain how a person facing the utmost of trials is able to face the turmoil, but still know deep down inside that God is in control. From a natural perspective, it seemed that every day there was a new obstacle to overcome. For example, after breathing problems came jaundice, but he recovered. Then there was bleeding from his bowel and the probable need to operate, but that disappeared. He developed feeding problems and they suspected an intestinal blockage. He started throwing up and the doctors talked of a stomach infection. He developed a fever and, unable to find another cause, the doctors tested for encephalitis. They told us they detected a heart murmur, but within days the murmur too disappeared. The doctors found what they believed was a hernia in his groin. Later they decided it was a cyst. Within a short time it too disappeared without a trace. During his time in hospital, Connor would endure so many needles that the still working veins in his arms, in his legs, in his hands and feet would collapse. And they would end up shaving the side of his head and insert needles into the veins in his scalp. Yet, each and every time we received bad news, God healed him. Now, over this time, he went backwards and forwards between hospitals. In all of this, God carried us through. 7.5 weeks after he was born, we were able to take him home. Now, would it have been any different if God had not miraculously intervened in the lift that night in the hospital? Would it have been different if the fear had won and instead of handing my son over to God, I'd tried to keep him to myself? Who's to say? But as for me, I know it was God's intervention. Each day he received healing after healing after healing. It is to God that I owe a great debt for the life of my son. Now today, my son, Connor, is now 34 years old. But even today, I know that he's not my own to keep. He's merely on loan to me while I am alive. He belongs to God. Something happened that night, and he has been given fully to God, and God has accepted him, and his life is God's to use. See, Connor wasn't just handed over to God for the period he was sick. I have raised him in the confidence and certainty that he has been set apart. Connor has the call of God upon his life. I wish I could explain to you the joy and wonder when at 5 years of age after a church outreach, Connor turned to me and said, "Daddy, can you pray for me? I want to give my life to Jesus." And for years I prayed that God would give me the grace to bring him up so that he can answer God's call. And he has. He is strong in his church. He preaches regularly. He's in a leadership role where he gets to encourage and build up others. He regularly preaches at various churches in itinerant roles. And he has a heart and a passion for seeking God that makes me proud. So I am glad that I got to give him to God right there at the very beginning, so that I've been able to watch what God is doing in his life. You see, there's something I think I've learned through all this, that God doesn't ask us to give him something so that he can take it from us. Those things where God pleads the greatest for us to trust him and give it to him is so that he can sanctify it, so that he can purify it, and so that he can hand it back to us blessed and as a blessing. And God doesn't take so that he can reduce our lives. He takes so that he can increase our lives. The Bible says that those who come to God must believe that he is, and he is the rewarder of those that diligently seek him. And that's what this testimony is all about. This isn't a testimony of how wonderful I did in a time of trial. Because I think if you were standing next to me, you would have seen all the fear, all the doubt, all the worry, all the tears, all the desperate prayers. And I don't think I would have looked like I was doing things that well. This testimony is about the goodness of God. And when God asks you to do the things that are the most difficult and the most extreme and the hardest things to do, it's because on the other side of that, he has so much for you. He has so much blessing that he wants to give you. And that's why we sacrifice our lives to him. That's why we trust him. And I don't know what you might be going through as you hear this testimony, and I don't know how difficult it is for you. That's true. But I have learned through my own painful experience that there is nothing like trusting God. There is no one that can be trusted more. There is no one more worthy of being trusted. There is no one that loves you more than God loves you. And there is no one who's more for you than God is. So whatever you're going through, if this testimony hits you in those times, then I just pray seek him. He does have the answer. He does have the answer. So that is the testimony of the birth of my son Connor. That's the testimony how God intervened in his life from the very beginning, and how God has led him through to be the man of God that he is today. And it's a testimony of how sometimes to keep the most precious things God has given us, he asks us to give them up. Not to take, but so that he can make them perfect. So I hope you've got something from this testimony today. I hope this has blessed you. I hope that you've received faith and hope as you've listened through what I've had to say. And finally, I'd love to hear from you if you want to leave a comment after watching this. Maybe this has affected you deeply and you want to share that. Maybe you just want to subscribe. That's fine too. But either way, I hope I've blessed you, and I hope God continues to bless you. So thank you for joining me over the side.